Today, I want to talk about the American Constitution as a solution to a collective dilemma faced by the original 13 states, as well as a framework for strategic interaction. The American Constitution created American political institutions. Institutions are the rules of the game. It's the context within which strategic actors act. In some cases, it defines the payoffs and the penalties of various actions. But doesn't Congress make the rules? Or maybe the President and the Supreme Court do? Now, it's true. Congress does make rules, and so does the President and the Supreme Court. But these branches of government create rules by which individuals, or sometimes states or political parties, pursue life, liberty, and happiness. The Constitution sets down the rules by which the branches of government themselves play. In a way, this makes them meta rules. The Constitution contains a lot of rules about rulemaking. Who gets to do what, with whom, and how applied to the branches of government. Let me give you an example. Both Congress and the Senate must approve legislation by a majority rule, and the President of the United States must sign it, and it must not violate provisions of the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court of the United States. So in order to get lawmaking done, you have a number of conditions that have to be met. And who sets these conditions? Well, the Constitution sets these conditions. This rule of constitutional procedure is a kind of meta rule, and the Constitution is just full of them. So the American Constitution sets up the rules of the political game that frames the actions of many strategic players, not just the branches of government. Statesmen, political parties, interest groups, and states must all take the Constitution into account when formulating strategies. So why did the framers feel the need to ratify a constitution for the 13 states? Why not just let things go as they had before? Or perhaps why not just not have a constitution? At a fundamental level, under the Articles of Confederation, the states did not like the game they were playing. And as we saw last time, if you don't like the game you're playing, you need to try to change the rules. What games were they playing that they didn't like? Well, the main one has many names: the tragedy of the commons, the collective action problem, the end player prisoner's dilemma. I'm going to go talk about it as the stag hunt. Like the game of chicken, the stag hunt is a metaphor that can be applied to many different situations. In the classic stag hunt, a group of hunters goes out on a hunt. If all the hunters work together, they can kill the stag and all eat. If they're discovered or do not cooperate, the stag will get away and everyone will go hungry. The hunters hide and wait along a path. As they lie in wait, though, a hare is seen by all the hunters moving along the path. If a hunter leaps out and kills the hare, he will eat, or if you want to make the payoffs a little more generous, he and his family will eat. However, this results in the trap laid for the stag to be wasted and ruined, and the other hunters will likely go hungry. So the dilemma here is that if one hunter waits, he risks one of his fellows killing the hare for himself, thus advantaging himself at the expense of everyone else. However, all of the hunters face pretty much the same dilemma. Now, if you remember the prisoner's dilemma for last time, you can see that there's a lot of parallels here, because the problem is essentially one of trust. If all the hunters can trust each other to restrain themselves, not go after the hare, keep their eyes on the big prize, the stag, then everybody and everybody's families are going to go home happy. But if they can't, then the incentives overwhelmingly favor taking the sure gain, right, the hare, over the more uncertain, larger gain, cooperative gain. So, what will happen? Well, for the most part, everybody goes after the hare, one of the person gets the hare, and everybody else goes hungry. And of course, this is an outcome that is collectively harmful, even though it's going to be individually beneficial for at least one of the players. So, the stag hunt, like I said, is a metaphor. Like chicken and the prisoner's dilemma, it's a strategic game, and it's a metaphor for situations where the cooperation of all or nearly all is necessary in order to achieve some great good, but the incentives for each individual is to pursue some other minor but much more certain good for themselves rather than risk sharing the profits of a larger collective good. In fact, the stag hunter is basically a prisoner's dilemma with more than two players. And you see these everywhere. Everything from car pollution to not paying for subways to fireworks displays. All of these can be modeled as basically multiple player prisoners dilemmas or stag hunts. So, back to the Constitution. Why did the representatives of the 13 states in North America seek to replace the Articles of Confederation, which was the treaty that previously regulated their interactions? Well, the Articles of Confederation failed to solve some fairly difficult collective dilemmas between the states. The states were like the hunters in the stag hunt, and the Articles of Confederation were not preventing states from going after hares, metaphorically speaking. The states faced a number of collective dilemmas akin to a stag hunt. National defense was probably the most important. Threats from Great Britain, France, and Indian tribes were all a kind of collective good to which everybody's participation was necessary, but each individual state had an incentive to let everybody else's troops go die rather than commit their own, which meant that nobody committed any troops, which means the national security of everyone was harmed. Internal security, much the same thing. Now, at the time of the Constitutional Convention, Shays' Rebellion was very much in the minds of most of the delegates there, and this was a rebellion that occurred in Massachusetts, where the federal government was very slow to respond, and many states didn't want to provide troops to put down the rebellion, which meant that the rebellion spread and caused more damage than it otherwise would have, and the delegates were very much aware that the federal government lacked the means to deal with these problems and needed the means to deal with these problems. Speaking of the means to deal with these problems, financial free riding was a big problem for the delegates at the Constitutional Convention. The Articles of Confederation did not establish a clear taxing power, which made it very difficult for anyone to get things done, and it made the United States not terribly credible on the international scene on top of that. That is to say that everybody looked at the United States and basically concluded the United States was probably not going to do anything because they weren't going to be able to raise the money to do it, which meant that American threats on the international stage were not very credible, and that made the United States as a group worse off than they were before. So these are all basically stag hunt like problems. The cooperation of all is necessary, but the incentive to not cooperate is high. As a result, nobody cooperates, in which case nobody gets the stag. And the stags here are the prizes, the national defense, the internal security, and the fiscal stability. So the Articles of Confederation were problematic in this respect because they had unanimity rules. And that made it difficult to get anything done. One state could always hold out indefinitely until it got a deal from the other states that it likes. But of course, every state had an incentive to hold out, which means that for the most part, everybody was demanding unreasonable terms like, I don't pay for anything and you pay for everything. And so as a result, very little got done. Now, if passing a new constitution was just a matter of getting things done, then the states could have easily transferred all power to the national authority. That would have gotten the job done. So they could have created a king, and other countries effectively did that. They nominated kings. But that wasn't the route the United States was willing to go. The states, in addition to a concern for solving collective dilemmas, also had a concern for local autonomy and individual liberty. After all, once you transfer power to the federal government, or even a king in some extreme cases, how do you keep that federal government or that king from wielding that power that you just gave to it in ways you never intended, and of course for their own interest rather than your interest? This brings up the question, and it's a perennial question in politics, who watches the watchers, or in Latin, quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Creating a stronger national government introduced a new player into American politics, and that meant the introduction of a new version of a time-honored strategic game called the principal-agent dilemma. The principal-agent dilemma, or the principal-agent problem as it's sometimes known, in its purest form sees a principal hire an agent to do something that the principal is unable or unwilling to do for him or herself. So in our example, the states hire the federal government in order to provide a collective good that the states themselves can't seem to provide on their own. That example is actually rather complicated because there are many states who don't quite have the same interests. So there are multiple principles with slightly diverging interests. And even with respect to the agent, the federal government, the way it's set up is that there's three branches of government. And so you could argue that the federal government itself is not a singular agent, but actually multiple agents. A simple example might be the car mechanic. And all of us, presumably, have had the experience of trying to hire a car mechanic for auto repairs. Now, most people hire a car mechanic because the mechanic can do things that they can't, or at least they have tools that they don't have, or perhaps they just have skills that you don't want to bother learning for yourself. But of course, the car mechanic's interests are not your interests, and worse, the car mechanic has expertise that you don't have. When two players in a strategic game have different levels of knowledge about the game, this is called asymmetric information. And if unconstrained, the agent can often use this information to pursue his or her interests at the expense of that of the principal. In the case of the car mechanic, this is pretty familiar territory. The car mechanic can use his superior knowledge of the costs of parts and labor to overcharge the customer. Can use his knowledge of mechanics to overprescribe unnecessary fixes and even fix things such that the customer needs to return for more work later on. In other words, asymmetric information provides a way for the agent to take advantage of the principal. And this doesn't just work for car mechanics and customers, it works very well for financial advisors and customers, doctors and patients, and of course athletes agents and their athletes. The customer, of course, is ignorant of mechanics, but that doesn't mean the customer is stupid. The customer knows that the mechanic has distinct interests from him or her and better information. So this affects how the customer chooses to interact with the car mechanic. The customer is going to shop around, ask for second opinions, use customer ratings agencies, or perhaps even ask friends for recommendations, or maybe even try to set up compensation mechanisms for the mechanic that delivers rewards to the agent only when the work is truly done. Of course, the car mechanic knows that the customer knows this, and so the car mechanic, being in competition with other mechanics for the customer's business, knows that his asymmetric information can get him so far. He can't completely take advantage of his customers. So what a car mechanic can do to try to get the business of a customer is to try and at least demonstrate or try and at least show the outward forms of trustworthiness. For example, the car mechanic can offer warranties. Now, offering a warranty can be powerful, and indeed it can be very useful for the customer in overcoming a principal agent dilemma. But as you know, real world warranties have lots of caveats and bylines that at the end of the day enable sometimes the person who's offering the warranty to wiggle out of actually making good on it. Another thing the mechanic can try to do is matching competitor prices, but of course we all know that there's asterisks on matching competitor prices, but at least if it's an honest offer, matching competitor prices is a way of saying I won't take advantage of you. Also, revealing insider information to the customer about the costs of doing business, literally showing you they can't do it for any cheaper than they're doing it, or revealing things about how their competitors might try to swindle them might be ways to gain trust with a customer. Of course, if we think about the federal government for a minute as your agent, the federal government is set up as an agent of the states. Today, we would say an agent of the American people. But you have to note that the federal government doesn't operate in a very competitive environment. This tends to mean that the bargaining power of the federal government is strengthened relative to someone in the car mechanic situation, because if you're not happy with the car mechanic, you fire the car mechanic and you go somewhere else than competition. And that's one way of looking at the Constitution, as a set of constraints on the federal government. So the Constitution tried to create a federal government competent and powerful enough to solve genuine collective dilemmas, but not so autonomous as to be able to dominate the states or the people. There are several elements in the Constitution which seek to limit the power of the federal government, and I'm just going to go over a few briefly here. We'll have a chance to talk about these in more detail elsewhere, but federalism, checks and balances, separation of powers, and democracy. We'll start with federalism. We said that the federal government has little competition, but at least for some kinds of collective dilemmas, they could be solved at a more local level. So effectively, there is competition. There's competition between the federal government, the states, and in some cases, city and local governments. All of them can provide a solution to the problem, and you, as a citizen, at least collectively with other citizens, have some choice about where you want that problem to be solved. Third, separation of powers. Now, separating the legislative, executive, and judiciary branches into distinct parts of government with distinct interests and distinct constituencies, and requiring each branch of government to cooperate with the others in order to get anything done, introduces a measure of conservatism and caution into the federal lawmaking process. In reality, there's not one federal government, as I said earlier, but several partially independent branches of government that have to work together. All branches have to cooperate for the federal government to act, and that means that secrets and conspiracies against the principal, the states or the population, depending on how you choose to look at it, are harder to pull off as a result. The last mechanism that the framers introduced to constrain the federal government might be the most important. This is democracy, or what the framers called a republican form of government. This introduces accountability for the agent by making his or her performance dependent on satisfying enough of the public. This is a way of making the interests of the principal and the agent align more closely. Recall that we said that one of the causes of the principal-agent dilemma is that the principal and the agent had distinct self-interests. Well, in a democracy, in an ideal democracy, the interests of the representatives and the interests of the people are one and the same. Now, we know that in practice that ideal is seldom, if ever, met, but you can see what they were aiming at in trying to make the federal government more accountable. The agent, in other words, more accountable. In effect, when we go to the ballot box every 2 years or so, we have the option to fire at least one of our agents and replace them with someone else. Now, the system the framers created, of course, has evolved over time to meet new challenges, new circumstances. And though the resources that the federal government commands are larger than they've ever been, many people have worried that the federal government is no longer very effective at solving collective dilemmas. So when it came to solving a few tasks that nearly everyone agreed it needed doing, the Constitution worked fairly well. So when it came to national defense, internal security, or raising taxes, the federal government and the original Constitution may have done quite well. But when it comes to acting in the face of sharp disagreement, the Civil War showed that the Constitution struggled to adapt to the demands of new circumstances. Ironically, while many people complain that the federal government is gridlocked and impotent to solve our problems, other people, and sometimes it's the same people, complain that it has also grown to an unwieldy proportions, smothering individual liberty and crowding out local solutions to local problems. As we move forward in this course, we will try to understand how these twin features of American government might have occurred, and we'll try to also see how much truth there is to each of these complaints.